Hello, I'm Michael Cantrell, and you are listening to the Prison Officer Podcast, a place to have a conversation about the forgotten cops that work in this country's jails, prisons, and correctional centers. A place for me to try to make sense of a career spent working inside the fence with some of the greatest people that nobody sees or recognizes for the important job they do to keep this world safe. If you love this podcast, hit the follow button, or better yet, share with your family, friends, or coworkers. In more than 28 years of corrections, I have used or supervised Pepperball hundreds of times. Now, as a master instructor for Pepperball, I teach others about the versatility and effectiveness of the Pepperball system. From cell extractions to disturbances on the rec yard, Pepperball is the first option in my correctional toolbox. With the ability to transition quickly from area saturation to direct impact with the non-lethal PAVA projectiles, Pepperball provides me with a range of non-lethal options for cell extractions involving non-compliant inmates, and when the use of force is over, decontamination is easy, with no oily residue on the walls or floors. To learn more about Pepperball, go to www.pepperball.com or click the show notes below. Pepperball is the safer option first. Hello and welcome back to the Prison Officer Podcast. Today's guest is Todd Craig. We worked together for many years. I've known him for quite a while. In the Bureau of Prisons, he's worked many jobs, and we'll talk about his path up through the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Right now, he's the National Security Director with Smart Communications, and he worked a long time in the Office of Security Technology. So I really want to pick his brain on some of the technologies that are moving into corrections and some of the changes that we can expect in the future. So welcome to the Prison Officer Podcast, Todd.
Thank you, Mike, for having me. It's a great opportunity. I appreciate you.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on here. We kind of lost track after we both retired for a couple of years, so it's good to see you again.
It's good to see you.
So I always like to start the same way. Tell me where you grew up and what it was like when you were young. What kind of youth did you have?
Yeah, I was born in Springfield, Missouri. I grew up in Leavenworth, Kansas, a somewhat famous prison town. My father was a regional chaplain administrator, but for decades, he was a senior chaplain at the United States Penitentiary there in Leavenworth, Kansas. And I guess I was destined to become part of the corrections industry. Yeah. My father took the theological path. I took the more security and the warden path. But early in my childhood, I mean, like everybody else, growing up in a small town values, it was great in Leavenworth. I have fond memories. But I can remember in the summer of 1973 and in the summer of 1974, my father was reached while we were out at family activities, and he had to go with the warden to deliver death messages to 2 correctional officers killed in 2 successive summers at riots at the United States Penitentiary at Leavenworth.
Wow.
And that left an indelible mark on me. And then growing up through high school, I had the fortune of meeting and talking with some officers, and that kind of cemented my future career calling as I left Leavenworth to go to college.
Okay. So you were you aware of what went on in prison? I mean, did your dad talk about it a lot? Or was it kind of, you knew a little bit about it, but he didn't bring much of that home? Did he talk about it?
He would talk about it, and a prison chaplain carries the burdens not only for ministering to the staff, but also ministering to the inmates. And because of his integrity and his spiritual approach, he went many times with wardens and regional directors to fix crises, to be there, kind of the early form of the crisis support teams we have in the Bureau now, like when a warden was removed. So my dad's ministry, his name was Manny Craig, reached up and down the organization, and as the good book says, was no respecter of persons. Staff, inmates, wardens, inmate families, community volunteers, Chuck Colson with Prison Fellowship, Billy Graham, so Corey Ten Boom, all great evangelical figures that ministered there at Leavenworth. I can remember it was a little bit different back in the day, but I can remember going in. I played trumpet in high school, and I can remember going in for Christmas Eve services and playing in the chapel service for the inmates. A spiritual song on trumpet. I can remember going in, and the world's strongest man at the time, Paul Anderson, he would come in, he would lift a table with like 12 inmates on it, and then he would witness about Jesus Christ. So at an early age, I was exposed to the correctional environment. I was exposed to spiritual faith in that environment.
Yeah.
And that was all very formative in my future career choice.
Sure. And prison chaplain, and I've talked about it before on some other episodes, that's a tough job. I mean, you go back and forth. The staff look to you and the inmates look to you. And I've always thought it was a very tough job.
Oh, for sure. I can remember in the Marble Hall at Leavenworth, my dad, first and foremost, not just spiritual life. He was a man of God, but he would respond to body alarms. He was there, but the inmates trusted him, and he was able to minister to them. The staff trusted him, and leadership trusted him. So he had a unique gift, a unique calling for prison ministry.
Yeah. Is he still with us?
No, my dad passed away 3 years ago.
Oh, so, sorry to hear that.
Yeah, thank you. I miss him every day, and his influence stays with me.
Yeah. That would have been a good interview too, sounds like.
Very much.
Yeah. So you graduate college. Do you go right to the Bureau of Prisons?
But of course.
Did you really? Okay.
Well, there was a little detour. When I was going to the University of South Florida, finishing up my undergrad and my graduate work in criminology, I worked for about a year as a probation and parole officer for the state of Florida Department of Corrections. And then when a new supervisor came in, found out about my Bureau connection, he let me go because he figured I would go with the Bureau anyway, and he wasn't wrong.
Yeah. At the time, Bureau was beating most people with the pay. So,
with pay, reputation, world leader in corrections.
Yeah. Okay. So where'd you start with the Bureau, and tell me what that was like that first day?
Well, it was interesting because I went out to California. I interviewed at Terminal Island as a correctional officer, and the warden, Richard Risen, had been selected to be warden at the United States Penitentiary Lompoc up the coast in Santa Barbara County. And they gave him the results of the interview, and he said, "No, I want you to go to Lompoc today and interview for caseworker." It was on a Friday. My ticket out of LAX was like 5 p.m. There was no way I was making it back. So I'll never forget. I went up there, interviewed, and when I got to the airport about 11 that night, the supervisor gave me a piece of paper and said, "Yeah, I'm going to put you on a plane, but if you lose this piece of paper, you're on your own." So I flew all night and got back into Tampa, where I was going to school early the next morning.
Right.
But that was my interview with the Bureau. And I started there in September of 1987. I was the first case manager hired off the street. So all the old hacks and guys that worked their way up were taking bets on how long College Boy would last. And it was there was a saying, the poke is no joke. Yeah. And 8 years were spent there, very formative, caseworker. And then I went to special assistant to the warden, really was a special investigator for the U.S. Attorney's Office in San Francisco on a case that went to the Supreme Court, Martin v. Risen. And the case was about, can an inmate write as a reporter with a byline and be published in a major newspaper? And of course, the Bureau had regs that said, no, you can't. You can't be reporting on what goes on inside. So we won at the district court level, won at the appellate court. The San Francisco Chronicle appealed to the Supreme Court, and they denied certiorari. But that was probably 2 of my first 4 years with the Bureau was spent working on that case.
Interesting. Not many people could say that they've worked on a Supreme Court case. Interesting.
No, and that kind of got me into the legal side of the Bureau. I'm not a lawyer, thanks be to God. But, and throughout the rest of my career, I would fight with lawyers on everything, the kingdom of no, when we need to do what is right to protect the staff, wardens, and officers in the field.
Absolutely.
So that was very formative. I then went on to be executive assistant to the warden and finished my time at Lompoc as camp administrator. I built the first kind of low-cost satellite work camp for $1 million back in 1991. Housed about 300 inmates, provided work crews to the one of the two existing Bureau farms at that time, full dairy herd and everything else.
Wow.
The low security FCI, and then for cleaning details inside the USP.
Wow.
And I got to tell you,
go ahead.
Working in penitentiary was the best possible training for a career in corrections.
Yes.
All the lessons I used throughout my career were learned in those 8 years at Lompoc. Whether it was an escape hunt, whether it was responding to homicides. I'll never forget, in April 1993, we had 4 homicides in 1 month. 7 SORT teams, special operations response teams, were brought in. The place was rocking and rolling. Because at that time, you remember, Lompoc was the only West Coast penitentiary.
Right.
So we have several out in California now, but it was it. It was converted. It was built in 1946 as a disciplinary barracks for the Army. Then in the 60s, the Bureau took it over and made it a penitentiary. Yeah. So all the life lessons one learns as a correctional staff member, supervisor, and ultimately warden were taught to me. And I got to say this. It's very important in corrections to mentor people, to be a rabbi to staff, to all staff, to be inclusive, but really to mentor. And I had some great wardens there. God rest his soul, Pat Cohane. In terms of warden, Dick Risen, and those life lessons, he taught me all I needed to know at that point early in my career. And I was really blessed to have that opportunity.
Oh, absolutely. Lompoc, that was the first penitentiary out there. And the Bureau, a lot of people don't know, part of the mission of the Bureau is to keep inmates in the area that they came from. So they always tried to keep them within a certain distance from their house, if possible, if it was allowed. Well, the gangs on the California coast were just, crazy at that time. So you guys were just packed full of gang members, correct?
Oh, it was, back then we monitored the 5 disruptive groups, as we called it. But yeah, it was a melting pot from Northern California, Southern California. It was the only high security operation. And I do want to put a disclaimer in here, Mike. Nothing I say today represents the Department of Justice, Federal Bureau of Prisons, the federal government, any manner, shape, form, or representation. I'm simply a Bureau of Prisons retiree, and just glad to be on the show. And hopefully some things that we share today will help those in the corrections profession.
Absolutely. I think people have already figured out that what I say on here isn't a representation of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, but I had a good career. I have no animosity towards the Bureau whatsoever. I had a good career and learned a lot like you. So did you know that Pat Cohane was from Springfield also, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. Nixon County, or Nixon was the town.
Yep. Great man.
And I saw Pat. I saw Pat at ACA in 28, and I second that. He was just a great man, great individual, great leader during difficult times.
Absolutely. So where'd you go from Lompoc? What was the next step for you?
Well, here's the next step. Pat Cohane got me selected as the Bureau's chief spokesman. And it was October 1995, which should ring a bell.
Oh, okay.
That was the nationwide, as we euphemistically called it, institution disturbances.
Yep.
Anyway, they put me on a plane. I was selected, but I didn't start for a couple months. They put me on a plane on a Friday night. I flew all night from Lompoc to Washington, D.C., got off the plane, got a car, went to work in the central office as the chief spokesman.
Wow.
And so I was there on temporary duty probably for, 6 weeks,
Mm-hmm.
and was the chief spokesman responding to those nationwide riots, working with Main Justice Public Affairs, White House, Executive Office of the President on coordinated statements. And it was a baptism by fire, but it was good.
Yeah. So had the riots already started by the time they picked you? Or
They
yeah.
started they selected me on a Wednesday. They kicked off, if I recall, on a Thursday. I was on a plane Friday.
Wow. Yeah, that would be a baptism by fire. Interesting. That's I haven't heard of that before. Did we have official public information officers back then?
We did. I replaced
Okay.
a guy by the name of Greg Bogdan, good dude. And there was an assistant there, Daniel Dunn, still a good friend of mine to this day.
Mm-hmm.
But Greg had retired, and they needed that leadership role filled. And, I worked 12,
You were the
14
man.
hours a day for the next 6 weeks.
Wow. So go from there. You're there for about 6 weeks. You get your trial by fire.
Go back to Lompoc, load up my family, drive across the country, and start there permanently. I was there from late 95 through early 99. Got the call, went as associate warden to FCI Allenwood.
Okay.
I served there for 5 years. I thought my career had plateaued. Nobody wants me. What's the next step? All those things that, if we're honest, and those listening to the podcast,
Yeah.
And I was so fixated at the time on the next step, as well as doing the job well where I was at.
Right.
But then the time came, and I was moved after 5 years. I was moved across the street to the United States Penitentiary, Allenwood.
Okay.
And there was a warden who retired pretty soon thereafter. And I was acting warden of the penitentiary for a period of time. And I guess at the time, my regional director thought I did an adequate job. And then I was selected as warden at Raybrook. So in the middle of January 2005, my family and I packed up our stuff, and the government moved us up to Raybrook. We arrived in a blizzard, and I have fond memories of North Country. That was a great institution, medium security. Mm-hmm. It was so remote, it kept its own special operations response team, had great relationships with New York Department of Corrections. They had a facility across the street, did a lot of joint training with them. I built the whole shoot house for the special operations response team. You got to know that Raybrook is situated in the Adirondack Park, which is very heavily environmentally regulated. And we had one of the only long-range firing ranges that state police, local police, I felt like I was running a training academy because everybody was using that. But when I got to Raybrook, it was really interesting because it was a medium security facility, but they didn't even really have as we call it today, a restrictive housing unit. It was like half of a unit, but there were none of the standard security features that we as correctional professionals rely on.
Right.
Like interior sally ports, the catwalks graded, barred, all that. So my very first day on the job, I went out and saw a maintenance worker outside, and I said, "You're going to be welding steel from the time I get here to the time I leave."
Right.
And he did a great job. I kept buying him steel, and we made that unit so secure that, in fact, I housed death penalty cases, and we actually had the special operations response team. We actually transported them to Terre Haute because for Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, that whole northeast quadrant, we were the most secure facility within about 6 hours. So they had to be there for the court process, and like in Burlington, Vermont, the district court. So really, I feel those were some of my best years, building the reputation, the security, taking care of staff at FCI Raybrook.
Absolutely. Wow, you went from one side of the country to the other, from sunny California to freezing Northeast.
Yeah, and it was a great opportunity. We hosted federal judges conferences,
Yeah.
crisis management training. We did a lot up there. And after that, I got the call to go to Beckley, West Virginia, the Bureau's different region in the Mid-Atlantic, the Bureau's largest medium security facility. And again, great staff, great institution. We did a lot of good work. And one of the hardest things as a warden, hardest thing as a correctional officer, I mean, is dealing with staff who compromise themselves. And we all make mistakes. There is redemption. The best thing is if you find yourself in a situation as a correctional professional, reach out, talk to your supervisor, talk to the warden, get help, stop it before it gets to a point where you've basically thrown away your career, your life, and your family. And the other thing that we don't talk a lot about in corrections, and we need to, and I think you have talked about it on a couple of your podcasts, and I commend you, is you've got to have a basis outside of the walls for your life.
Yeah.
Your family, spiritual faith, exercise, constructive use of your time. You've got to have something to balance the stress, the negativity, the life safety issues that you face every day walking the line. And I would just say to staff, develop that outside network that has nothing to do with corrections.
Which is hard to do.
It is very hard to do.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean drinking a beer with the boys after work.
Well,
that means, developing, investing in your family and having a faith and doing other things that will buttress you against the verbal, emotional, and sometimes physical assault that all of us correctional staff face. I mean, I've been assaulted, and a lot of staff have lost their lives. And as a warden, I buried an officer, and that leaves an indelible mark on your soul. And that's why I'm so passionate about contraband interdiction, which we'll get to in a little bit,
right,
in terms of staff safety, preserving their lives, because I don't want another warden, whatever, federal, state, local, county jail sheriff, to have to do that.
Absolutely. It is tough to find that balance outside. I know sometimes I thought that I was getting away from work, but then my wife would tell me, she'd say, you guys know that you don't do anything but talk about work when you're together. And I'm like, yeah, but I did find stuff, and I think you're absolutely right. You can't let work become everything. Find a hobby, find something outside of work to be a part of and to give your brain a break, because we don't realize how tough it is. We get used to it, No,
and I mean, the literature's out there that suggests, and more importantly, guys like you and I and those listening to your podcast know the mental toll, and in fact, I would argue PTSD that comes, particularly from working in high security correctional environments. And one thing I did was invest in my sons, and we got involved in a scouting program and just did things that with the boys even had like a snow and lawn business that I helped oversee until I couldn't do that anymore as associate warden. I couldn't be out shoveling snow at 4 a.m. and then getting in there at 6 o'clock trying to run the joint. So
sure.
Just other things.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Beckley, West Virginia, what's your next opportunity that comes up?
I got a call to go to the Office of Security Technology.
Okay.
And it turned out to be the very best career move. And no offense to my fellow wardens and regional directors, and I finished my career as assistant director, and I'm very thankful for that opportunity to Mike Carvajal. But that was the single best job in my career.
Yeah.
And I've got to thank great mentors like Sonia Thompson, who's the assistant director for Office of Technology and Data.
Yep.
I mean, she never walked a day in a prison, but she is brilliant. She got it. She's
absolutely.
She understood the role of security technology and protecting staff and inmate lives.
Yeah.
She got it. She supported it. And I miss her this day. We continue to be ever hopeful that our Las Vegas Raiders will one day have a winning season, but that seems
Las,
to be
Las Vegas is a gambling town.
lift.
It could happen.
Yes, you never know.
You never know.
So I went into Office of Security Technology in end of 2008, and at the time when I went in there, it was a think tank. The director would call. He'd want a paper on, Harley Lappin was director then. He'd want a paper on long-distance acoustic hailer. In other words, using sound to control a riot situation.
Uh-huh.
So there were a lot of smart people in that office, technologists, engineers, and they'd write a paper, and he'd read it, use it for his congressional testimony, what have you. I had a little bit different vision. And I served as acting and chief for well over a decade in an office before finishing my career as acting assistant director.
Mm-hmm.
I had a little bit different vision. Let's not talk about it. Let's do it.
Right.
And I think you hit it right on point, Mike. The rise of technology has hit the corrections industry. We are 20 years behind the commercial space or other entities in terms of technology. We just are.
Right.
And, you've got all kinds of initiatives under the First Step Act, tablets, and things we never thought we'd see in prison. In fact, wrote a paper probably 12 years ago that argued for giving an inmate a cell phone.
Right.
I didn't write it because I'm an old warden, but the guys in the shop wrote it.
Yeah.
And at the time, I said, you guys are crazy. What are you talking about? But what is a tablet today? In many state facilities, the tablet can be used by the inmate to make calls, video visits, their commissary, their email.
Yep.
I mean, that day has come. And with technology, it's not a matter for us in corrections. We do need to be forward thinking. We do need to be forward looking. And for every countermeasure, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know, Mike, for every countermeasure we develop, the inmates have 24/7 to figure out how to get around it.
Absolutely.
So when you shut down avenues of contraband introduction, as the rise of drones the last 3 years, actually the last 5 years, now it's air delivery. It's LAX over some prisons here in America.
Mm-hmm.
And it's publicly reported. I was very fortunate to have the support of agency leadership to stand up the Bureau's counter-drone program before I left.
Right.
I was one of the 4 architects of the Emerging Threats Act of 2018 that gave DOJ and DHS the same legal authorities to detect and take down drones that Department of Defense, Department of Energy had CONUS. But that was a heavy lift to get that legislation passed.
Yeah.
In fact, it was extended by the omnibus that just passed. But there'll be the good news for those of your listeners that are state and local correctional practitioners is there's going to be a provision in that bill called the state, local, territorial, and tribal. And what that means is that state prisons, county jails will be authorized to not only detect, but under federal agency oversight and sponsorship, they'll be actually able to mitigate or take control of drones, whether it's through the RF signal or a physical hunter-killer drone, but they'll actually be able to take control of that drone and put it down. So I know that's going to be introduced in this session of Congress, and I know it has bipartisan support.
Wow.
Because really, and I hope you'll let me ramble for a minute.
Sure,
here.
absolutely.
There are 3 existential security threats to the 3,500 federal, state, local, military, and tribal jails across the country. Those are drones, contraband cell phones, and synthetic and opioid drugs in the postal mail.
Yep.
Drones have become the avenue of introduction. For example, when a effective managed access system is installed that basically cuts off the inmate's ability to use contraband devices, then they look for introduction by a drone. And unfortunately, with the trend we're seeing, again, publicly reported,
Sure.
It's not just cell phones, SIM cards, synthetic drugs on these drones. The drones are commercial grade, like Matrice 5600.
Nope.
They're able to carry 15 to 20 pounds of contraband. And recent cases, they're carrying escape paraphernalia.
Yeah.
And the Office of Inspector General did a great report on the threat of drones to the Bureau, but you can extrapolate that for your state and local listeners.
Mm-hmm.
That basically this delivery system, it's not too far from the day because of the rise of technology for drones. And drones are good. I mean,
Right.
they're trying to integrate it into commercial airspace in the country. You've got Amazon and other companies testing out drone delivery of packages.
Sure.
There are many plus sides to this technology, but there's also the dark side. And for us in prison, we're on the front lines trying to combat it. And increasingly, we have to think about when drones can drop a weapon.
Mm-hmm.
Can drones drop an explosive device to either foment an escape, a mass disturbance, and eventually, and it's already out there, the technology, can a drone airlift an inmate
Getting
and effectuate their escape?
Yeah.
Yeah, so those days, and when you say you're exactly right, when we have to be looking ahead, we have to be looking ahead, not just looking ahead, getting the legislative authorities to do something about it,
Right.
getting the budget, the appropriations to get it funded, and we need to get out ahead of the curve rather than simply reacting, which unfortunately, because corrections is the end of a funding funnel, many times we're not funded, and until something bad happens, we don't get the support to do anything about it.
Right. Yeah, that was something even myself, years of working in corrections until I came up to DC and we worked together. And I got to see how hard you were working behind the scenes for the funding, for the legislation, for everybody was just like, well, let's just do this. Well, it's not just let's just do this. There's a lot of people involved in some of these decisions, and especially with electronics, FAA, FCC. I mean, you can go on with the acronyms who are involved in that type of stuff. You mentioned
exactly. It's for example, if you want to jam a cell phone, the Bureau of Prisons is one, because it's a federal law enforcement agency, it has the authority to jam. But we cannot exercise that authority without approval from those entities you listed.
Right.
The FAA, so it doesn't interfere with the avionics. The Federal Communications Commission, in an advisory role to the National Telecommunications Information Administration. And that has to be turned on. In fact, to my knowledge, only the FBI and the Bureau of Prisons have ever gotten authority to do that. It's called a special temporary authority.
Right.
And we've done tests in 2010, 2018. We did a joint operation with South Carolina Department of Corrections 2019. It's all out there in the historical public record. But also in the record is the fact the Bureau is moving ahead with a number of sites for micro jamming, but it's a long process to get the policy support, the political support, the legislative authority, the budget to do it, because countermeasures to technology is very expensive, and it's a multi-year process. And because as a warden, I would do everything I could legally within my power to protect the staff, but in this case, you can't.
Right.
I mean, there's a legend that goes around the Bureau about an officer or a warden that before my time, I had no supervisory role, I didn't know anything about it, but bought a Chinese jammer and started jamming cell phones. Well, you can't do that. You got to do it the right way.
Right. Here's just a little article I picked up January 23rd, and I think it's from the AP. It says top state prosecutors from across the country are again urging Congress to pass legislation allowing state prisons to jam the signals of cell phones smuggled to inmates. Devices, the attorneys argue, allow prisoners to plot violence and carry out crimes. Simply, we need Congress to pass legislation giving states the authority to implement a cell phone jamming system to protect inmates, guards, correctional officers, and the public at large. The 22 prosecutors, all Republicans, led by Attorney General Alan Wilson, wrote a letter to Kevin McCarthy and Chuck Schumer. They also cited a 2018 gang-related siege that raged for more than 7 hours at a South Carolina prison, killing 7 inmates. One inmate describes bodies literally stacked up. Corrections official blamed the orchestrated violence, the worst in U.S. prison history in 25 years, in part on illegal cell phones. And I don't think the general public understands why cell phones are such a problem. They've got one. Why shouldn't an inmate have one? But can you talk to that a little bit about what they cause in prison?
Absolutely. Not only do they cause criminal conduct or facilitate criminal conduct in prison, but they also increasingly enable inmates to commit crimes against the public, which should be a concern. Even if they're not concerned about what goes on inside prison, they should be concerned about their own safety. And, you see in the public record, there have been several child pornography rings busted on contraband cell phones at the federal prison in Fort Dix. My good friend, Brian Sterling, Director of Corrections for South Carolina, he put together a major case targeting inmates who use contraband devices to fleece American military members by a fake dating site out of a lot of money.
Wow.
You always see the scams for Social Security, IRS, and all this is facilitated by the use of a contraband device. And the problem at that institution was they had a managed access system. But unless that system is tested, inmates will find the security vulnerabilities. They'll find the areas that it doesn't cover. And then they're able to communicate to their criminal associates on the street. They're able to communicate with it from institution to institution. For example, if they wanted to coordinate a system-wide work stoppage or disturbance. So I've been chasing cell phones in blizzards in the high desert for 15 years. And every countermeasure we put in place, the inmates find a way around it. Probably the most effective technology today is called a mobile managed access cellular assessment. And basically, a vendor who has the authority under an FCC sublicense sets up, you're able to get the transactional data off contraband devices within the geospatial confines of a prison. And then thanks to the FCC ruling that came out last summer, you do not need a court order, but you can send an administrative request, the warden can, to the 3 big carriers and have the phone, the IMEI, the electrical serial number, and the SIM account, the subscriber identity module account, put in the stolen phone database, and essentially the phone's turned into a brick.
Oh, okay.
So the FCC has authorized that by rule, and as long as the contraband interdiction system, as it's called, meets all the legal and regulatory requirements.
Right. Wow. Yeah. We always chase cell phones, and now I did an article for Corrections One a couple of years back about contraband getting smaller, and that's part of the problem. It's harder for us to chase a SIM card. It's harder for us to chase, a cell phone now is, they got little flip phones that will almost hide with your hand. So we've got contraband running around our prisons that's so small these days that it's hard to keep up with.
For $29.95, you can get a body orifice ready little fob cell phone.
Yeah.
That you have to use a pencil to dial, but it works for $29.95, and it even instructs visitors how to secrete it and inmates how to carry it in the institution to avoid detection. So,
oh wow! So they're actually putting it out there for that.
Yeah,
wow.
Unless they developed a conscience and have taken it off their website. But yeah. That's been around for a number of years. And in fact, the technology now is, basically cell phones on a credit card.
Yeah.
So that's a thing.
Wow. Another thing I ran across, it's been a little bit back, we were talking about drones. Now, drones are a bad thing in one way, but I saw a company who has come out with basically there's 4 drones that sit on your perimeter. And if there's an escape, you can hit a button or send them up in the air, and you've got these 4 drones searching grids with infrared immediately after an escape, which I was just like, what do we need bloodhounds for anymore? That's just crazy thought that we have that out there. Have you seen anything like that or know anything about it?
I could, but I can't tell you about it.
Okay.
No, it's in the public domain, and I do want to say nothing I say today advocates a specific vendor or product.
Yeah.
But there are all kinds of, they've been developmental mainly for the Department of Defense market, but they are basically full-time, 24/7 perimeter surveillance, because we in corrections have never done a good job of looking outside the fence, right? We've always, our focus has been keeping the bad guys in.
We always look one way.
Yeah, exactly. But now cameras are starting to point out these robust perimeter surveillance system of drones, not just for the emergency situation like an escape or a disturbance for surveillance, but routine perimeter surveillance that is robust, ruggedized, reliable. The technology is already there, and it's being deployed in some military environments.
Wow. So let me ask you about this. We haven't spoke about this before. I don't know. What do you think about the AI stuff that's coming out? Chat GPT and stuff like that. They say some of it, enables sophisticated surveillance and monitoring. Have you ran into anything like that, or have you dealt with the AI portion that's coming around?
Well, AI is deployed in many security technologies already. And I guess to go back, kind of marking our age, Mike, Skynet is real.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's what that technology points us to. Can it be a great tool? For example, when you have a video camera, a digital video camera, and if you have with an infrared sensor, and you have onboard data analytics, it's called at the edge, AI can run algorithms to sort real threats, for example, body mass of a human from a squirrel, whatever, and reduce the false alarms to the control center. And we deployed that technology a decade ago at Fort Dix and ended up with the arrest of over 40 civilians for contraband introduction into Fort Dix.
Wow.
So the technology's there, but it's... I guess I want to talk a little bit about unintended consequence, right?
Sure.
So you deploy this, and we all have been following the articles about chat bots and taking on human characteristics, and can they be reliable? Can they be regulated? Do they really add to it, or are they going to disrupt your technology? And for example, the big push to put tablets in every prison in America for reentry programming, for consolidation of inmate communication services, whether it's phone, email, video visitation, all those things. The bottom line is, even when you put in a secured infrastructure, and I know I'm kind of getting down the weeds, but secured access points, trunk communications, all those things, intrusion detection systems, intrusion protection systems, all those things, inmates will find a way to circumvent the technology.
Yeah.
And just look in the paper, or online rather. Nobody reads the paper anymore. I forget where I was. I saw
you just dated us again.
I know. I was like, okay, that's cool. There's actually a paper copy, but I can remember reading that on the train going into D.C. every day when I was chief spokesman. But now it's all at the fingertips. You got to sort news from fake news and all those things. But the unintended consequence, what is provided to the inmates as a legitimate programming and management tool, can be circumvented just like a contraband cell phone to threaten the public safety. So, corrections comes down to committed staff managing difficult people.
Yeah.
And technology can augment or help the frontline correctional officer do their job, but it will never take the place of a correctional officer doing their job. I was at a conference recently and saw pretty cool robotic dogs. And the Air Force, it's been publicly reported, they're using robot dogs for perimeter patrol, at least at one base. I think it's a pilot basis. I can see that augmenting, just like drone surveillance, augmenting perimeter security. But you're never going to be able to take the human operator out of the loop in corrections. You just can't, because it's people managing people.
Yeah. Well, and AI and robots and stuff you're never going to get past sixth sense or gut instinct. There's a lot of that in corrections and in law enforcement in general. I saw this morning, I was reading some of my podcast stuff. So here's a new one that's come out. Basically, they have an AI that if I will speak 70 sentences into it, from that point, it will mimic my voice, and I could type out my podcasts from now on. And you'll think you're hearing me, but all I did was type it out. And I was like, wow, there's some... I couldn't think of the good with that. I guess maybe for some people with communication problems, maybe it might be something great, but I thought so many ways that could be misused. Of course, I'm a correctional officer, so that's where my brain goes.
As it should, Mike, as it should. I mean, there's an article 2 weeks ago about a congressman that had his speech written for him by AI. The problem, and you see this on the internet, the deep fake, as it's called, not just voice, but visual representation of an individual. And I think we're not too far because the technology is already there. Can you imagine deep fake of public officials, deep fake of economic officials?
Sure.
It'll cause chaos.
Oh, absolutely.
And so the technology for biometric identification, fingerprint, iris, facial recognition, heartbeat, all kinds of different technologies. You're going to see a rise in biometric identity management. For example, a project I worked on was giving inmates in the community a smartphone for supervision rather than the outdated GPS ankle bracelet. And on that phone, not only is there random, constant biometric identity management, there were proximity sensors. So if a phone of an individual on the program was in proximity, for example, if they were sex offenders, it would send off alerts. But all these systems, technology will only be as good as the staff manning them. They have to be properly trained. They have to be properly supervised to make the technology effective. Let's go to a standard in the corrections world, the metal detector. Been around 50 years. We rolled out the world's most sophisticated metal detector, network profile capable, at the Bureau to the penitentiaries. But the bottom line is, if they're not properly installed, if they're not properly calibrated, if staff are not held accountable to run every single inmate through the checkpoint every time and not just wave them through, and technology reduced the workload on the frontline officers. For example, an inmate that had a metal rod in their leg from an operation or a fragment of a bullet from their criminal lifestyle, when they got enrolled, all that was calculated down to the fraction of the gram. So the detector was smart enough, and this was 10 years ago, to detect what approved metal in the body was, dental or fillings, whatever, from carrying a shiv or a contraband cell phone in an orifice. But if staff don't use it, it's not calibrated, it's not maintained, it's not gonna work to its intended purpose for our operational use case in corrections.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought that up. The episode just before this one, I talked about when I was at Leavenworth, they had a guy who kept going through the metal detector, had a pin, and he'd go off, and we'd pull him aside. What's going off? Let me see what you got. I got a pin in my hip. And running back through the metal detector, visual search him, the whole works, didn't find anything. Well, everybody got in the habit of letting him go ding, and they'd let him through, And finally, one day, somebody, whoever it was, went over to medical and said, "Hey, does he have a pin in his hip?" No. And so they took him down to investigations, and he had a Swiss Army knife that he had keistered for more than 2 years. So, and
that was not dissimilar when we rolled out those metal detectors to USP Coleman. I forget if it was 1 or 2, but an inmate who for 2 years had been keistering cell phone and SIM cards. He said, "You finally got me." Because on the old metal detectors, staff were not able to. And I want to talk just a minute about corrections deploying a system of systems for contraband interdiction.
Sure.
What does that mean, Craig? What that means is when the inmate gets off the bus, they go through a whole body imaging device. So you know what they have. And in fact, increasingly, and sad to say, state systems are now rolling out that device for staff coming to work, staff visitors and contractors.
Right.
But the Bureau rolled it out for inmates. Then they get enrolled in the metal detector down the fraction of the gram. Then we maintain the metal detectors throughout the housing, work areas, program areas. And that is number one line of defense in terms of metal control inside the facility. Then you've got a layer on top of that, contraband cell phone systems, which are incredibly expensive. A fixed system is $3 to $4 million a site. That's why the mobile assessments at about $25,000 for a 2-day shot. At least you identify the phones and you get them turned off.
Right.
Makes sense with the limited budget of corrections.
Yeah.
Counter drone system. You've got to stop the airport above you, dropping contraband. You've got to have good doctrine on site to, when a drone is detected, standard correctional practice. Lock it down, get the inmate secured, do the search, maintain visual line of sight. And then eventually, as the Bureau, and it's now in their budget, they'll be able to roll out mitigation where they'll actually be able to take down the drone.
Wow. Yeah.
But just to give your listeners a perspective, it took me 10 years to get funding for contraband cell phone, and it took me 5 years to get it for counter drone.
Right.
So nothing moves fast in Washington, I assume in state capitals or in county seats.
Right. No, and we all deal with budgets.
I do want to touch on one other threat.
Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, just touch on the other existential security threat, and that's synthetic drugs in the mail. In the fall of 2019, I was actually at Beckley where I served as senior warden. I was putting in contraband cell phone equipment. There was a body alarm. An inmate had smoked fentanyl analog laced postal mail and overdosed right there on the concrete floor of the housing unit. I went back, saw the then director, got the money. We put 2 pilots in place, and we eliminated 100% of the synthetic drugs. And for your listeners, and I know it's a common problem faced by all 3,500 correctional institutions across the country,
right?
It's oil soluble, so fentanyl analogs, K2 spice, Flocka, crocodile, concrete, all this stuff, even raid spray, ant spray, is soaked on alternate pages of postal mail. It's brought in. It's a big part of the inmate underground economy. Inmates smoke and get high. If they don't overdose, then they assault one another, assault staff. And our staff are most at risk in the mailroom sorting this. I mean, you see the public records. A nurse at Thompson about a month ago, her face, hands went numb. She was taken to an outside facility where she got help. Thanks be to God, that's all it was.
Right.
But right now, there is no standoff detection in the mail for either synthetic or opioid drugs. That works. And it's not just a problem for the Bureau of Prisons. It's postal inspectors, Customs and Border Protection with international mail. And I worked that issue for many years. And the reason I've gone with the company I've gone with is they're the most innovative in corrections technology. And they've done digital mail scanning. They patented it in 2015. All the mail goes off-site to a clean room. It's screened. It's digitized, sent back to the inmates.
Yep.
Ultimately, it can be read on a kiosk. If the inmate so chooses to get the greeting card from Little Sally, they can get that 30 days after. We verify, once again, that it's totally contraband and narcotic free. But 5 months ago, Dane County, Wisconsin, county jail, little girl sends her dad, I believe it was a birthday or happy Father's Day card. The ex laced it with fentanyl. He opened it. He died. So the threat of synthetic mail and drugs is real.
Yeah.
I mean, on the federal level, there's great support from the Council of Prison Locals, from legislators, and from the agency and justice itself. But again, it's a matter of getting it funded and then getting it deployed to protect those frontline officers, mailroom staff, and the inmates
right.
From themselves, if you will.
Right. Yeah, I just talked to some people from the state of Missouri, and I believe they're either going to that or they have gone to that. That may be one of the places you're working with. But I do have a question for you, because it seems like I hear about a lot more in custody deaths that are that don't have a used to when I started in prison. If somebody died in custody, we usually knew because they killed themselves or somebody else killed them. But a lot of this, it
Right.
seems like they're maybe dying from these drugs. And how hard is it for us to know if they died from fentanyl? Is that some of these unexplained deaths that happen in their cells?
You might be an old dog, Mike, but you're right on point.
Okay.
You're right on point. Here's the problem. You have a lot of unsolved homicides now in correctional facilities because of the practice of criminal associates of inmates weaponizing the male. What do I mean when I say weaponizing the male? They target rival gang members. They target, even within their own gang, as you know, prison gangs take internal discipline.
Yep.
They may even target correctional staff. And unfortunately, providing nitrite gloves to correctional staff to open mail, or setting up your own process where you're copying it, you're still exposing the staff to the risk.
Right.
There are increasing number of unsolved homicides, and from what I've seen, I concur with you.
Right.
Fentanyl analog exposure is probably a leading cause.
Yeah.
I think history will prove that to be true.
So, and we've covered a lot of stuff here. You may have already covered some of this. What do you see on the horizon? What should people be looking for corrections? Whether it's detection or whether it's more problems that you see coming up. Anything else that we haven't covered?
One unpopular subject, I think, the staffing crisis that has hit every correctional agency in this country, trying to hire, recruit, retrain qualified correctional officers and correctional staff, is just going to get exacerbated in the time to come.
Right.
And technology can fill some of those gaps, but it cannot replace dedicated correctional professionals doing their JOB, doing their job, area searches, pat downs, doing all those things for internal and external security. So I think with the rise of good technology, such as tablets, correctional professionals are going to have to be ever more vigilant to inspect those systems, to test them, boots on the ground before they're deployed, to put them through cyber attacks, to develop really a system of coordinated contraband interdiction. In other words, you're going to have to screen and inspect staff and really do it. And as you and I both know, after 4 o'clock and on the weekends, a correctional institution runs totally different.
Sure.
It's just a fact of life. So staff, visitors, contractors, every package that comes through needs to go. Right now it's going through X-ray package scanning, just like TSA, which has the funding. They've deployed CAT scan machines. I think that'll eventually come to Bureau of Prisons facilities with the funding. So every good and package gets scanned. Every individual person gets scanned coming in the facility. There is a system of systems of whole body imagers, sophisticated networked metal detection, counter drone detection, and eventually mitigation, contraband cell phone interdiction, and synthetic mail prevention from it coming in. And the only way to do that right now is send it off-site, digital mail scanning. But if you limit access of people, you limit access of goods, you limit access of postal mail. And in fact, I think you'll see encrypted legal mail systems. Congress last session mandated the Bureau of Prisons implement a secure inmate attorney-client email system. They did not fund it. I think they'll probably fund it in the near future. But I think technology, just like video visitation, one of the greatest threats for narcotics interdiction since the eons of time when the Bureau of Prisons was established in 1930 has been the visiting room. Well, if you move that to video visitation, at least for a significant portion of time, you greatly reduce the inmate's ability to introduce contraband and the visitors, and you don't put staff at risk interdicting the contraband introduction activity.
Do you think we have to be careful? Do you think technology has a tendency to make us lazy? Do you think we get used to letting it do things for us?
Well, I think we've all been following, and as a father of many, the ills of social media and the impact on child development, and all those things. I think the same can be said. And the problem with technology is when we become reliant on it, or, for example, you're the control center officer in charge, and you have a particular perimeter intrusion alarm system that has a high number of false positives.
Right.
What do? You turn it down, you ignore it. And, that's just the reality of working in a prison.
Sure.
And unfortunately, that 100th alarm can be the one where the inmate escapes and puts the public at risk as well as your staff.
Yeah.
So
that's been proven a couple of times.
Tendency to become too, according to the public newspaper reports. Yeah.
Right.
But I think if the more we become relying on technology, there's got to be commensurate technology deployed. For example, insider threat technology. Now, most correctional staff don't deal with classified information, but they deal with sensitive but unclassified information. And that information can be sold. There's a number of prosecutions, sold to rival gang members, sold to those in the street. And we need to do a better job of insider threat tracking as staff become more and more reliant on desktops, on laptops. And one thing we can never do in corrections, you can't call it in. You can't sit on your laptop at home. Not today.
No.
You've got to be in the prison doing your job. But I think we have to put safeguards in place that monitor staff, not just from bringing illicit technology in. And I helped write the 2010 Contraband Cell Phone Act. But I think the criminal penalties need to be increased from a misdemeanor in a year to a felony in 5 years. I think any technology, I've read these articles of state facilities trying to attract millennial and Generation Z correctional officers, actually allowing them with supposed safeguards to bring their personal cell phone in.
Right.
They're going to be distracted. They are not going to be able to focus on their job. And then it's going to be used for illicit purposes, and the staff are going to find themselves jammed up. So I just think a bright line has to be drawn, and the technology we do deploy to assist correctional officers and correctional staff in doing their job has to be monitored, has to be updated, has to be kept current, and leadership of the institution is leadership by example, leadership management by walking around, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
There's no substitute for boots on the ground. If you're the warden or the lieutenant or the SI, the special investigative supervisor, or the senior officer, you walk by the metal detector and it never goes off, you need to check the calibration rate. You need to see if it's actually plugged in. I kid you not, Mike.
Oh, I know.
You've seen it. I've seen it. Right?
Yep.
And it's all fun and games until a fellow officer or staff member gets stabbed.
Yep. Absolutely. So what are you working on now? What's keeping you busy in retirement?
Well, the reason I went with Smart Communications is it's the most innovative corrections technology company, and we deploy a whole suite of inmate communications products from digital mail scanning, legal mail scanning, of course, phones, email, video visitation, etc. And I'm still keeping my hand in the counter drone space, the contraband cell phone space.
Right.
And what you're really seeing is a synergy of technologies for both good and evil, if you will. The drone drops the contraband cell phone that's used to set up the drop from the outside. And I really think it takes a coordinated approach I speak regularly at national conferences, just trying to share and impart whatever knowledge I may have gained to help the officer on the line and the warden who's asking for the budget to get the technology funded, deploy it in the right way, monitor it, and increase the life safety of every correctional officer in America and every adult that's incarcerated.
Yeah, absolutely. I've always admired your passion for this. First time I met you was when I went through lieutenant school, and you were just passionate about technology and how it could help us and getting it implemented. And then we got to work together in DC, and I really got to see you at work. So I've always respected how passionate you are and how hard you work to get some of this stuff in there.
I've respected you, Mike, and I miss those lieutenant classes. Those were some of the best.
Oh, yeah.
And that's why I did those lieutenant classes. I mean, I did the new wardens and new AWs, big deal. I wanted to reach that next generation of correctional leadership with the pros, the cons, and what I saw coming in technology, so they would advocate for it, they would embrace it to increase their life safety and everyone that's doing time.
Right. I will put a link to Smart Communications in the show notes for those that are interested. Would you like to leave a way for listeners to get a hold of you if they have some questions or something?
Sure. I think I'll just use my Smart Communications email. It's todd.craig@smartcommunications.us.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on here, and maybe we'll get a chance to do this again. Technology's moving quick, so we may have to have another podcast and try to keep up with it. But I appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Mike, for the opportunity, and I'm at your disposal, sir. So I look forward to talking with you again soon.
Excellent. Have a great day.
You too, sir.
If you enjoy these podcasts, the best way to support the Prisoner Officer Podcast is to share these episodes with your friends or family on social media. Let me invite you to visit www.theprisonofficer.com. If you haven't already, check out the Prison Officer Podcast on Facebook and click that little follow button. Or leave us a message, or better yet, leave us a review. And if you're listening to us on Apple Podcast, Google, or Spotify, please click the subscribe button. Till next time, I'm Mike Cantrell. Watch your back, and please take care of each other out there behind those walls.